The harshest voice you'll ever hear isn't out there. It's the one inside your own head, the one that whispers you're not enough, while demanding you be everything. You've been told that self-criticism is discipline, that being hard on yourself is how you grow. But what if it's not? What if the voice that promised to protect you has been the one keeping you trapped? Here's the truth. No one wants to say out loud. Self-criticism isn't love disguised as toughness. It's fear disguised as care. And the moment you see that, everything shifts. This isn't about being softer. It's about being free. And it starts by understanding something most people never realize. The critic inside you isn't the enemy. It's a wound pretending to be a weapon. And this video, it's about what happens when you finally stop fighting yourself and start listening. There's a voice inside that never rests. It whispers through the cracks of every decision, every pause, every mirror. It doesn't shout, it just lingers, like smoke from a temple that's been burning for years. You've heard it so many times you forgot it wasn't always there. It says, "You're not enough," and somehow you believe it. Not because it's true, but because it sounds like you. Self-criticism doesn't feel like violence at first. It feels like responsibility, like discipline, like the sword a warrior sharpens before battle. Eastern philosophy teaches that the mind can be both weapon and wound. And this voice? It's both. It cuts you down in the name of making you better. But here's the paradox. The same blade that promises transformation is the one that keeps you bleeding. You think you're being hard on yourself because you care. But what if that harshness is just fear, dressed up as love? The psychology of pain reveals something most people overlook. Self-criticism is a defense mechanism. It's the ego's way of staying in control. If you attack yourself first, no one else can hurt you, right? Wrong. What actually happens is this. You become the judge, the jury, and the executioner. You create an inner courtroom where you're always guilty. And the sentence? A lifetime of trying to prove you're worthy of your own affection. This is shadow work in its rawest form. The part of you that criticizes is the part that was once criticized. And it learned to survive by becoming the threat. Imagine a river that refuses to flow. It builds walls around itself, convinced that stillness equals safety. But water wasn't made to be trapped. It stagnates, it grows heavy. It forgets what it was. That's what happens when self-criticism becomes your default. You stop moving, you stop trusting, you start performing for a version of yourself that doesn't even exist. And the saddest part? You think this performance is called growth. But growth doesn't come from punishment. It comes from seeing the wound clearly, without flinching. Let's get practical for a second. Think about the last time you made a mistake. Maybe you said something awkward in a conversation, or missed a deadline, or hurt someone unintentionally. What did your inner voice say? Probably something like, "You always mess things up. You're so stupid. Why can't you just be normal?" Now imagine a close friend made that same mistake. Would you speak to them that way? Of course not. You'd offer understanding, patience, perspective. So why do you withhold that from yourself? This isn't about being soft. It's about recognizing that self-awareness without compassion is just another form of suffering. And suffering without awakening is just noise. The mind creates a protector, someone who watches, someone who measures, someone who decides whether you're doing it right. In Bushido, the sword is an extension of the warrior's spirit, sharp, precise, meant to defend what matters. But what happens when that sword turns inward? When the one who was supposed to guard you becomes the one who wounds you? This is the inner judge. And it doesn't just criticize, it sentences. It tells you that healing requires perfection, that love must be earned, that you're only valuable when you're flawless. Here's the trap. The inner judge believes it's helping. It thinks that by being strict, it's keeping you safe. After all, If you're always one step ahead of failure, you can't be blindsided, right? But this logic is flawed. The harder you try to control yourself, the more rigid you become. The more rigid you are, the easier it is to break. Taoism calls this Wu Wei, effortless flow. The river doesn't force itself downstream. The wind doesn't struggle to move. But the human mind, it fights, it resists. It turns self-improvement into self-punishment. And somewhere along the way, the person trying to heal becomes the wound itself. Let's talk about trauma healing for a moment. Most people think trauma lives in the past, but it doesn't. It lives in the present, disguised as the voice that tells you you're not safe unless you're in control. That voice? That's the judge. It was born the first time someone made you feel like you weren't enough. Maybe a parent who demanded excellence. Maybe a teacher who shamed you in front of others. Maybe a relationship where love felt conditional. So you learned to do it yourself. You became the critic before anyone else could. And now, years later, you're still performing for an audience that doesn't exist. The shadow holds what the ego rejects. In Jungian psychology, the shadow isn't evil. It's hidden. It's the part of you that was told it wasn't acceptable. And the inner judge? It's the gatekeeper. It keeps the shadow locked away because it believes that's what keeps you lovable. But here's the truth. You can't hate yourself into wholeness. You can't shame yourself into peace. The sword that cuts you down isn't making you stronger. It's making you smaller. And every time you believe its voice, you're choosing the illusion of control over the reality of being human. Think about this. When you look in the mirror, what do you see first? Your flaws, right? The weight, the wrinkles, the scars, the things that don't match the image you think you should be. But what if that reflection isn't the problem? What if the problem is the lens? Buddhist philosophy teaches us about impermanence. Nothing stays the same, including you. Yet the inner judge demands consistency, perfection, a version of you that never stumbles. And when you inevitably fall short, it doesn't offer grace. It offers punishment. This cycle, this endless loop of striving and failing, is what keeps emotional pain alive. Not the mistakes themselves, but the refusal to meet them with kindness. Beneath every harsh word you speak to yourself, there's a question. Not a loud one, not an obvious one, but it's there, humming quietly in the background like a mantra you never chose to recite. The question is this: am I worthy of love? And the fear underneath it whispers back, only if you earn it. This is where self-criticism takes root, not in logic, not in reason, but in the terrifying belief that love is conditional. That if you slip, if you fail, if you show the parts of yourself that aren't polished, you'll be abandoned. So you stay vigilant, you stay perfect, you stay exhausted. Eastern philosophy speaks often of attachment, the clinging to things we believe will save us. But there's another side to that coin, the fear of detachment. The fear that if you let go of control, if you stop performing, if you stop being the version of yourself that's acceptable, no one will stay. This fear doesn't announce itself. It operates in the shadows. It disguises itself as ambition, as discipline, as self-improvement. But strip away the mask, and what's left? A child who was once told, implicitly or explicitly, that they weren't enough as they were, and that child is still inside you, still trying to prove their worth. Let's get real for a second. Think about your relationships. How many times have you apologized for things that didn't require an apology? How many times have you shrunk yourself to make someone else comfortable? How many times have you said yes when you meant no, just to avoid the possibility of being seen as difficult, selfish, or cold? This isn't kindness. This is survival. It's the mind-body connection responding to an old wound. Your nervous system learned early on that love comes with conditions. And now, even when you're safe, even when you're alone, you're still performing, still auditioning, still trying to be worthy of a love that should have been yours from the start. The psychology of pain teaches us that unresolved hurt doesn't disappear. It metastasizes. It becomes the voice that says, "You're too much. You're not enough. You're broken." And the irony? That voice sounds like protection. It convinces you that by staying small, by never making waves, by being endlessly self-critical, you're keeping yourself safe. But safe from what? From rejection? You're already rejecting yourself. From failure? You're already failing to see your own humanity. The truth is, self-criticism isn't armor. It's a cage. And you're both the prisoner and the guard. Consider this. When a tree grows in rocky soil, it doesn't blame itself for struggling. It doesn't look at the trees in fertile ground and think, "I must be doing something wrong." It just grows, slowly, painfully, but it grows. Yet humans, we look at others and assume their ease means our struggle is a personal failure. We internalize the obstacles as evidence of unworthiness. Zen philosophy reminds us that suffering is universal, but the story we tell about that suffering, that's where the real pain lives. You're not unworthy because life is hard. You're human because life is hard. But somewhere along the way, you confuse the two. And now every challenge feels like proof that you don't deserve compassion, especially not from yourself. There comes a moment when the mask slips, not dramatically, not all at once, but quietly, in the middle of an ordinary day. You catch a glimpse of something you've been avoiding. Maybe it's a pattern you keep repeating. Maybe it's a version of yourself you swore you'd never become. Maybe it's the realization that the person you've been punishing is you. This is the confrontation with the shadow, the part of you that holds every rejected piece, every exiled emotion, every truth you couldn't afford to face. And it doesn't ask for permission to be seen. It simply appears. In Jungian psychology, the shadow isn't the villain. It's the orphan. It's the part of you that was told it wasn't acceptable, so it learned to hide. But here's what most people don't understand. The shadow doesn't just hold your darkness, it holds your light too. Every time you rejected your anger, your sadness, your desire, your needs, you pushed a piece of yourself into the shadow. And now, that shadow is heavy. It's tired, and it's asking to come home. But the ego won't let it in. Because if the ego admits it was wrong, if it admits it's been cruel, if it admits it rejected the very love it was seeking, it has to face its own guilt. Self-forgiveness sounds like a gentle concept, but in practice, it's brutal. Because to forgive yourself, you first have to see yourself, not the version you present to the world, not the curated story you tell about who you are, but the raw, unfiltered truth, the mistakes you regret, the people you hurt, the times you abandoned yourself, the moments you chose fear over love. Shadow work demands this kind of honesty. It asks you to sit with the parts of yourself you've spent years running from, and it doesn't offer you a quick fix. It offers you a mirror, and that mirror reflects everything you've been too afraid to hold. Let's talk about karma for a second, not as some cosmic scoreboard, but as cause and effect. Every action creates a ripple. Every thought shapes a pattern. Every word you speak to yourself becomes the foundation of how you see the world. If you've been telling yourself you're unworthy, unlovable, broken, guess what? You'll create a life that reflects that belief. Not because the universe is punishing you, but because you're punishing yourself. And the shadow, it remembers every moment you chose criticism over compassion. Every time you silenced your truth to keep the peace. Every instance you swallowed your pain to appear strong. It remembers. And now it's asking, when will you stop? Here's a practical example. Think about the last time someone genuinely complimented you. Maybe they said you were kind or talented or inspiring. What did you do? Chances are, you deflected. You said it was nothing, or luck, or that they were just being nice. Now ask yourself, why? Why is it easier to accept criticism than praise? Why does acknowledgement feel uncomfortable, but self-attack feels familiar? The answer lies in the shadow. You've been carrying the belief that love must be earned, that worthiness requires proof, that acceptance is conditional. So when someone offers you love freely, your system rejects it. Because if you accept it, you have to confront the fact that you've been withholding it from yourself all along. And that realization, that's where spiritual transformation begins. There's a breaking point, a moment when the weight becomes too much, when the voice that promised to protect you has done nothing but destroy, when the effort to be better, to do better, to be enough, finally runs out of fuel. This isn't weakness, this is collapse. The kind that happens when you've been holding yourself together with willpower and shame for so long that your hands just let go. You're not giving up. You're falling apart. And in that falling, something shifts. Because for the first time in a long time, you're not fighting. You're just here. Broken, exhausted, real. Buddhism teaches about samsara, the cycle of suffering that continues as long as we cling to illusion. And what's the greatest illusion? That you can hate yourself into happiness, that you can criticize yourself into peace, that if you just try harder, push further, demand more, you'll finally be free. But the opposite happens. The more you fight yourself, the more you fracture. The mind becomes a battlefield, and you're on both sides of the war. The ego dissolution starts here, not as enlightenment, but as exhaustion, not as wisdom, but as the simple, undeniable realization that this isn't working anymore. Let's be honest. You didn't want it to come to this. You thought you could manage. You thought if you stayed disciplined, if you kept the rules, if you followed the path you were supposed to follow, it would get easier. But it didn't. It got heavier. The inner stillness you read about in Zen philosophy felt like a lie, because your mind wasn't still. It was screaming, and the more you tried to silence it with control, the louder it became. Until one day, you just stopped. Not because you wanted to, but because you had no choice. The collapse isn't a decision. It's a surrender you didn't know you needed. Here's what happens in that collapse. The defenses drop, the armor cracks. The self you've been trying so hard to maintain crumbles, and beneath it, not the perfection you were chasing, not the fixed, flawless version you thought you'd become, just you, raw, unfiltered, human. And here's the thing no one tells you about suffering and awakening. They're not separate. The collapse is the awakening, not because you suddenly have all the answers, but because you finally stop pretending you do. You stop performing. You stop auditioning for your own approval. And in that stopping, there's space. Not peace yet, not clarity, but space. Think about a temple that's been standing for centuries, strong, unmovable, revered, but inside the is rotting. Cracks run through the walls. The structure is held together by nothing but habit and history. And one day, a storm comes. Not the biggest storm, not the worst, just a storm, and the temple falls. Does that mean it was weak? No. It means it was already broken. It just hadn't admitted it yet. That's what the collapse feels like. You weren't weak for breaking. You were human for holding on as long as you did. And now? Now the question isn't how to rebuild the same structure. It's whether you even want to. Because maybe, just maybe, what needs to rise from the rubble isn't a stronger version of who you were, but the truth of who you've always been. After the collapse, there's silence. Not the kind you're used to. Not the absence of sound, but the absence of war. The voice that's been narrating your failures, cataloging your mistakes, predicting your next downfall. It quiets, not because you defeated it, but because you stopped feeding it. You stopped arguing. You stopped defending. You stopped trying to prove you were worthy of your own existence. And in that stopping, something strange happens. The mind, for the first time in years, doesn't know what to do, so it just rests. And in that rest, there's a kind of peace you forgot was possible. Mindfulness isn't about controlling your thoughts. It's about witnessing them without becoming them. But most people skip this part. They think meditation means clearing the mind, achieving some blissed-out state where nothing bothers them. That's not how it works. Meditation is sitting with the noise until the noise realizes it doesn't need to shout anymore. It's watching the inner judge take the stand, deliver its verdict, wait for your reaction, and getting none. Not because you're suppressing it, but because you finally understood. That voice isn't you. It never was. It's just an echo of every wound you never got to heal. And echoes fade when you stop calling back. Detachment doesn't mean not caring. It means caring without clinging. It means holding your own humanity with open hands instead of clenched fists. Taoism speaks of non-attachment as the path to freedom, not from life, but from the illusion that you can control it. And here's where the shift happens. When the inner accusations stop, you're not suddenly perfect. You're not suddenly free of pain, but you're no longer at war with it. The emotional pain is still there. The history is still there. The scars are still there. But the need to punish yourself for having them, that's what fades. That's what the silence brings. Not the absence of struggle, but the presence of grace. Let's get practical. Imagine waking up tomorrow, and the first thought isn't about what you need to fix, prove, or accomplish. The first thought is just breath, just presence, just the simple recognition that you're here, alive, imperfect, and somehow that's enough. This isn't some distant spiritual ideal. This is what happens when you stop treating your existence like a problem that needs solving, when you stop seeing yourself as a project. When you realize that self-awareness without self-cruelty is actually possible. You don't need a monastery. You don't need a guru. You just need to stop agreeing with the voice that says you're broken. Here's the paradox. The silence doesn't arrive because you earned it. It arrives because you stop demanding it. You stop performing for it. You stop believing that peace was something you had to achieve. In Zen philosophy, there's a teaching. Before enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. After enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. The tasks don't change. The world doesn't change. What changes is the relationship you have with yourself while doing them. The judgment that once clouded every action, it thins. And what's left isn't perfection. It's presence, not the end of pain, but the beginning of something softer. Something that's been waiting beneath the noise all along. When the silence settles, a new way of seeing emerges. Not through effort, not through force, but through something quieter. Something that feels almost foreign at first. Compassion. Not the kind you've been giving to others while withholding from yourself, but the kind that looks at your own mess, your own mistakes, your own brokenness, and doesn't turn away. It doesn't excuse. It doesn't justify. It just sees. And in that seeing, there's no judgment, no demand for change, no conditions attached, just the simple, radical acknowledgement. This is what it's been like for you, and you've been carrying it alone. Eastern philosophy teaches that the mirror reflects without attachment. It shows what's there. No commentary, no criticism, no distortion. Just truth. The compassionate gaze works the same way. It's the ability to witness your own suffering without needing to fix it immediately. To see the ways you've hurt yourself and others without collapsing into shame. to recognize the patterns you've repeated without declaring yourself beyond repair. This isn't apathy. This is acceptance, the kind that doesn't wait for you to be better before offering you kindness, the kind that meets you exactly where you are. Here's where trauma healing truly begins, not in the pursuit of perfection, but in the practice of presence. Most people think healing means erasing the wound. But what if healing is learning to hold the wound without letting it define you? What if it's realizing that the parts of you that feel broken aren't failures? They're fractures that let the light in. The compassionate gaze doesn't deny pain. It acknowledges it. It honors it. It says, you were hurt, and that matters. You survived, and that matters too. And for the first time, maybe ever, you're not asking yourself to be anything other than human. Let's talk about a real example. Think of a time you made a mistake that still haunts you. Maybe you hurt someone you loved. Maybe you missed an opportunity. Maybe you failed at something that mattered. Now, instead of replaying it with the usual script, I'm so stupid. I always do this. I'll never get it right. Try this. Imagine you're watching it happen to someone you deeply care about. What would you say to them? You'd probably offer context, perspective, understanding. You'd remind them that people make mistakes. That growth is messy. That one moment doesn't define a lifetime. Now, offer that same grace to yourself, not as a reward, but as a practice. This is the compassionate gaze, and it rewires everything. In Buddhist philosophy, there's the concept of metta, loving kindness that extends to all beings, including yourself. But here's the part most people miss. Self-compassion isn't indulgence. It's not letting yourself off the hook. It's holding yourself accountable and holding yourself gently. It's recognizing that you can acknowledge harm without becoming the harm, that you can take responsibility without drowning in self-hatred. The shift happens when you stop seeing yourself as the enemy and start seeing yourself as someone who's been doing their best with the tools they had. Not perfect tools, not always the right tools, but the ones available. And maybe, just maybe, that's enough to begin again. Something unexpected happens when you stop fighting the critic. It doesn't disappear, it doesn't apologize, but it softens, because the critic was never the villain. It was a guard standing at the gate of your deepest wound, trying to make sure you never got hurt that way again. It was clumsy. It was harsh. It mistook cruelty for protection. But underneath all that noise, there was a singular intention: keep you safe. And once you see that, once you understand that the voice wasn't trying to destroy you, but didn't know any other way to love you, everything changes. The integration begins, not by silencing the critic, but by listening differently. In Jungian psychology, integration means bringing the shadow into the light. It means sitting with the parts of yourself you've rejected and asking, what were you trying to tell me? The critic, for all its venom, holds valuable information. It knows where you feel vulnerable. It knows what you're afraid of. It knows the standards you've internalized and the beliefs you've never questioned. When you stop taking its words as truth and start hearing them as clues, you begin to unravel the deeper story. The story beneath the shame, the wound beneath the words. And in that unraveling, there's no longer a need to be at war. There's only the slow, patient work of understanding. Let's get practical for a moment. The next time the inner critic shows up, and it will, try this. Instead of arguing with it or collapsing under its weight, pause, take a breath, and ask, what is this voice protecting me from? If it says you're not good enough, ask, when did I first learn that love was conditional? If it says you can't trust yourself, ask, what happened that made safety feel like control? This isn't about psychoanalyzing yourself into oblivion. It's about recognizing that every harsh word is a breadcrumb leading back to an original wound. And when you follow those breadcrumbs with curiosity instead of judgment, you stop being the victim of your own mind. You become the witness. And witnesses don't take sides. They just see. Spiritual transformation isn't about transcending pain. It's about metabolizing it, about taking what hurt you and letting it teach you. In Taoism, there's a teaching about water, the softest element, yet it carves through stone, not by force, but by persistence, by flow, by meeting resistance without becoming it. That's what integrating pain looks like. It's not dramatic. It's not a single breakthrough moment. It's the slow, steady process of allowing your suffering to become your teacher instead of your tormentor. And the critic? It becomes less of a dictator and more of a consultant, still opinionated, still loud at times, but no longer in charge. Here's the shift. When the critic speaks, you no longer believe it's revealing your inherent brokenness. You recognize it's revealing where you still need healing, where you're still carrying an old belief, where you're still trying to earn something that was always meant to be freely given. The psychology of pain teaches that unprocessed hurt becomes repetition, but integrated pain, that becomes wisdom. Not the kind that makes you invincible, the kind that makes you human, the kind that says, I've been through this, and I'm still here. And maybe that's the whole point. There's alchemy that happens when you stop condemning yourself. Not instantly, not all at once, but gradually, like ice melting into water. The rigidity softens. Judgment, for all its sharpness, is actually crystallized pain. It's suffering that's been hardened into verdict, wrapped in the illusion of control. But understanding is fluid. It moves. It breathes. It doesn't demand that you be anything other than what you are in this moment. And when judgment transmutes into understanding, something ancient shifts. The critic doesn't vanish. It transforms from executioner to witness, from enemy to guide. Eastern philosophy has always known this. Opposition creates suffering, but acceptance creates space. Not acceptance as resignation, but as recognition. The Tao teaches that trying to force the river only exhausts you. The water will flow regardless. So too with your own nature. You can spend a lifetime judging yourself for being human, or you can spend it understanding why you became the way you did, why you developed the defenses you have, why you built the walls, why you learned to speak to yourself in a language of lack. This isn't excusing harm, it's contextualizing it. And context is where compassion lives. Let's talk about shadow work again, but deeper this time. Integration isn't just about seeing your darkness. It's about understanding why it's dark. The parts of you that feel unacceptable weren't born that way. They were made that way. By a world that had narrow definitions of worthiness. By people who couldn't hold their own pain, so they projected it onto you. By systems that valued productivity over presence, achievement over authenticity. You internalized those voices. You made them your own. Now you're learning to separate truly yours from what you borrow. That's the mutation. From belief you're fundamentally flawed to understanding. Here's a practical, think about one I always. Now, instead of accepting that as fact, ask, where did I learn this? Who said it first? What happened that made me believe it? When you trace the belief back to its origin, you realize something crucial. It's not a truth. It's a conclusion drawn by a younger version of you who was trying to make sense of circumstances they couldn't control. And conclusions, those can be revised, not erased, but revised. From judgment to understanding, from condemnation to curiosity. The mind-body connection reveals this transmutation in visceral ways. When you live in judgment, your body knows. It carries the tension in your shoulders, the tightness in your chest, the exhaustion that never fully lifts. But when understanding arrives, when you begin to meet yourself with curiosity instead of criticism, the body responds. Not magically, not immediately, but slowly you'll notice. The breath deepens, the jaw unclenches. The nervous system, so used to being on high alert, begins to remember what safety feels like. Because understanding doesn't demand change before offering peace. It offers peace as the foundation for change. And that's when spiritual transformation stops being an idea and becomes an embodied experience. When the war ends not because you won, but because you finally put down the weapons. Freedom doesn't announce itself with fireworks. It doesn't arrive as some grand epiphany where suddenly everything makes sense. It shows up quietly, in the smallest moments. Like the first time you make a mistake and don't spiral. The first time you disappoint someone and don't collapse into shame. The first time you look in the mirror and don't immediately catalog what's wrong. Inner freedom isn't the absence of fear. It's the presence of trust. Trust that you can stumble, fall, fail, and still be worthy of your own kindness. That's the shift. Not perfection, but permission. Permission to be human without needing to apologize for it. The inner Tao begins when the self stops punishing itself. Wu Wei, effortless action, isn't about doing nothing. It's about acting from alignment instead of anxiety. It's about responding to life without the constant internal commentary that says you're doing it wrong. Think about how much energy you've spent second-guessing yourself, rehearsing conversations, replaying interactions, wondering if you said the right thing, did the right thing, were the right thing. That exhaustion? That's the cost of living under constant surveillance. But when you stop treating yourself like a suspect in your own life, there's space. Space to breathe. Space to choose. Space to simply be without needing to justify your existence every second of the day. Let's talk about guilt for a moment. Real guilt, the kind that arises when you've genuinely caused harm, is functional. It prompts repair. It invites accountability. It asks you to do better. But the guilt most people carry isn't that. It's the residue of old shame, packaged as responsibility. It's the belief that if you're not constantly vigilant, constantly self-correcting, constantly atoning, you'll slip back into being the version of yourself you've been taught to fear. This guilt isn't a guide. It's a ghost. And inner freedom comes when you stop letting that ghost dictate your choices. When you realize that acting from love, real, grounded, messy love, doesn't require the threat of punishment to keep you in line. Here's a practical example. Imagine you're in a conversation and you say something that lands wrong. The other person gets quiet. Your stomach drops. The old pattern would be to immediately spiral. I'm so stupid. I always do this. They hate me now. I ruined everything. But with inner freedom, there's a different response. You notice the discomfort. You acknowledge it. And then you simply address it. Hey, I think that came out wrong. What I meant was no collapse. No catastrophizing. Just a clean correction. That's what it looks like to act without the fear of error. Not because you'll never mess up, but because messing up is no longer evidence of your unworthiness. It's just part of being alive. Buddhism speaks of nirvana, not as a distant paradise, but as the end of suffering caused by clinging. And what have you been clinging to? The idea that there's a perfect version of you waiting on the other side of enough effort. But here's the truth. That version doesn't exist. There's only this one. The one who tries and fails and tries again. The one who loves imperfectly. The one who hurts and heals and hurts again. And when you stop demanding that this version be anything other than what it is, that's when freedom arrives. Not as a destination, but as the quiet realization that you were never broken to begin with. You were just afraid of being seen as you are. And now, You're not afraid anymore. So here you are, at a crossroads. Not the end of something, but the beginning of a question that's been waiting for you all along. What if the voice you've been obeying isn't the one you need to follow? Because the real work doesn't happen in the understanding. It happens in the living. In the moment you catch that old voice rising up, and instead of believing it, you simply notice it. In the breath you take before you react. In the choice to meet yourself with the same tenderness you'd offer someone you love. The question isn't whether you'll stumble again. You will. The question is, will you punish yourself for it, or will you finally let yourself be human? You've spent so long thinking the answer was out there, in the right book, the right practice, the right person. But what if the answer has been here all along, in the way you hold your own brokenness, in the way you speak to the parts of yourself you've been taught to hide? What if healing isn't about becoming someone new, but about remembering who you were before the world told you that you weren't enough? This path doesn't stop here. It deepens. Because transformation doesn't happen all at once. It happens in the small, quiet choices you make when no one's watching. In the way you treat yourself when you're alone. In the grace you offer when you fall short. That's where the real shift lives. Not in perfection, but in presence. Not in the absence of pain, but in how you hold it. So let me ask you this. Are you ready to stop being your own enemy? Are you ready to see the critic not as the truth, but as a teacher? Are you ready to hold your pain without letting it define you? Because if you are, then what comes next isn't just theory, it's practice. It's the ancient wisdom that's been pointing to this moment all along. And there's one force, one teaching, that cuts through the noise louder than any other. If you want to understand how silence becomes strength, how stillness becomes power, how letting go becomes the ultimate act of control, then you need to see the force that silences. Lao Tzu would call it peace. Because what you've just witnessed here, that's only the surface. The depth, the real transformation, that's waiting in the next step.